Hey guys, it's Biblegirl, and today I'm going to do another Ask Biblegirl. But first, let me apologize for the weird looking bed that's messy. I'm packing for college. Summer's over and I'm moving back to the dorms, so I'm moving everything around the room and it looks terrible, and I'm packing things. I just packed a ton of stuff today, so lots to do. But our question was put on my profile in a comment by user Skull Screamer 118. Soul Screamer 118. And I figure I should just read the whole thing. It's not initially a question. A question pops up in there, so. Okay, he wrote, women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission. 1 Corinthians 14:34. As a woman and a Christian, you should be aware of all the sexist, misogynistic, and patriarchal perspectives in the Bible. You believe that God made you not as an equal, but to be subservient to men. Is this how you want to live your life? Or are you going to make up some rationalization to defend the Bible? Why would you want, and want in all capitals, to follow this doctrine, which demands your slavery? And he quotes Corinthians again. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for women, but women for men. For this reason, and because the angels, women ought to have a sign of authority on their head. 1 Corinthians 11:9-10. Okay, so I definitely have a lot to say about the question that wrapped up in there about why would you want to follow this, why would you want to live this, and stuff. So I'm going to jump into it by talking about 1 Corinthians, actually. There's a lot of other things I could talk about. But 1 Corinthians, since you quoted two things from 1 Corinthians, I figured I would explain to you the book. Now, there's a problem a lot of people have with the Bible, and that's called proof texting. And honestly, I really didn't think about it till I went away to my school. And the thing is, if you pick anything out of a book, any one line, you're not going to understand it properly. I could pick up Twilight and read some sentence about, I don't know, but you can pick up anything, and I could read Harry Potter and read a line Voldemort says and judge the entire book series off of Voldemort's life, and he's the villain. So the thing is, you can't just grab things out of scripture as we pick and choose. And I'm not blaming you for doing that, Soul Screamer, because honestly, the church does that all the time, and it really annoys me, especially with kids. Like, let's learn our memory verses, and not that learning scripture is bad, it's awesome, but we don't teach the context around the scriptures or anything, and it's a really poor model for the way that the church acts in general. So we're going to talk about the book 1 Corinthians and understand the story and what's going on. Because another thing about reading New Testament books is you're reading someone else's mail, and you need to understand what's going on, because you're only getting one perspective, one part of it, and it's all jumbled if you're just unaware of the background. So the church in Corinth was interesting, to say the least. It was a very debaucherous, inappropriate city. Lots of sex and craziness went down there. Had a lot to do with it being a city that sailors went through, and the Rena Temple there, and all this crazy stuff happened. You gotta put that and you're blindfolded and away from. You have to understand about that, because without understanding that, you're not gonna get anything about this book, because it was a desolate place moral wise. It was crazy. And so we're gonna jump right into Corinthians to understand it and put everything in context. So in chapter 1, we find out that Paul is taking an account from the house of Chloe to find out that there's fighting going on in Corinth. And that's why he's writing the letter. It's part of it. Verse 11 says, "For it has been reported to me by Chloe's people that there are quarrels among you and my brothers and sisters." I'm using the NRSV, by the way. So, what I find really fascinating in this book that a lot of people use to prove that the church hates women is they are taking this complete account from a household run by a woman. And Chloe and her people are brought up throughout this book. So she is kind of important and not frowned upon for being important. Sorry. I think I'm getting a cold. Okay, and I totally would encourage you to read the entire book on a whole. I've done that, and I've studied it like academically. So I'm not going to be going through the entire book, but please do, because understanding the context, again, is what's really important. Okay, so chapter 7, we get into a discussion about marriage. And there's actually a really interesting thing going on, because people are thinking it's the end of the world. And Jesus coming back any day. That's the mindset that the people had in the first century, in the early church. So some people weren't having sex with their husbands and wives. And Paul is telling them, hey, you should have sex with your husband and wife. It's cool. You don't need to be all holier than thou about things. You're married. And there's just really awesome understanding a woman in chapter 7. Okay. Starting in verse 1, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote," because it was from the letter the Corinthians wrote to Paul. "It is well for a man not to touch a woman." That's what Corinthians said in their letter. "But because of each case of sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, likewise the wife to the husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a set time, to devote yourselves to prayer, and then come together again, so Satan may not tempt you, because of your lack of self-control." Okay. Understanding first century Roman society, Greek thinking, I think even Jewish. This is crazily amazing for women. Paul is saying women, when they're married, have the rights to their husband's body. In fact, they own their husband's body for their sexual needs. Likewise, the husband, they have this interlocking connection for each other. But the woman is equal right there with her husband. And this is actually the only place in all of Paul's writings where it talks about a married couple coming to agreement, which is intense for this book that people use to say that the church hates women and that they're putting women down, because, oh my gosh, equal. This is ridiculous in that time period for Paul to say such a thing. But he sees women in a marriage relationship as equal to their husband sexually, and neither part of the couple should be deprived of their needs. Just fantastic. Because it's so respecting. Okay, now the next part is out of chapter 9, and that's actually where you quoted chapter 11, I'm sorry. And that's actually where you quoted your verse was 9 and 10, and in mine it says, "Neither was man created for the sake of women, but women for the sake of man. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol authority, and because of the angels." Okay, so I'm going to rewind and put it in context. And we'll start in verse 2 of chapter 11. "I command you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions as I hand them to you. But I want you to understand Christ is the head of every man, and the husband is the head of the wife, and God is the head of Christ. And any man who prays or prophesies with someone with his head in disgrace of his head, with something on his head disgraces his head. But any woman who prays or prophesies with her head unveiled disgraces her head, and it is one of the same things as having her head shaved. For a woman, if will not veil herself, then she should cut off her hair. It should disgrace a woman to have her hair cut off, or to be shaved, or she should wear a veil. For a man ought to not have his head veiled, since he is in the image and affection of God, woman and man. Indeed, man was not made for woman, but woman for man. Neither for the sake of woman, but woman for the sake of man." And I'm sorry, I'm going back to your verse. Okay. This thing you were putting in as misogynistic and stuff, you actually have to understand the historical context. And they're talking in, first of all, about men, not if they pray with their head not covered, it's a thing. And then women having to have her head covered. And this again has to do with Corinth and the sexual debauchery of the area. In that society, a woman with her head uncovered was thought of as a prostitute. So the verse you're using is Paul saying, hey, don't be scantily clad and going out and praying. It would be like a girl walking around in, I don't know, a tube top with her midriff showing and wearing a really short skirt saying, I love Jesus. It's inappropriate because she's making herself overtly sexual in a position where it's not meant. Because earlier, remember, Paul said sex is good just in marriage. But it's inappropriate for a Christian woman to be dressed in a sexual way. That's definitely the issue that's going on with the first verse you brought up. Paul doesn't want these women to be looked at like the other people in Corinth. They're not the prostitutes. They're not a temple prostitute. I mean, it also had to do with like looking like you were honoring a false god too. Paul just wants the girls to dress respectably so it doesn't cause an issue, because a lot of people were saying bad things about the Christians back then. Okay, so we are moving on to chapter 14 for me and for you. You quoted verse 34. Women should remain silent in churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission.